Waiter insults black man at luxury restaurant. Turns pale when he learns who he is. The Lexington Bistro, tucked in the heart of Beverly Hills, was one of the most exclusive dining spots in town. It was the kind of restaurant where the clink of fine china and crystal glasses was the backdrop to intimate conversations about business, art, and the world's finer things. The walls, lined with rare artwork and flickering candlelight, exuded a quiet luxury, as patrons, dressed to impress in sleek suits and shimmering jewelry, dined under soft golden chandeliers. It was an evening like any other at the bistro, at least. It seemed that way. The hum of content conversation filled the room as people enjoyed their meals. The menu featured a mouth-watering selection of gourmet dishes, from decadent steaks to delicate lobster bisques. But tonight, the story was not about the food. It was about the man who would sit down at one of the best tables in the house. A man who, at first glance, seemed out of place among the polished crowd. His name was Miles Turner, a 39-year-old tech mogul who had just closed a high-stakes deal worth millions. Miles had never been one to flaunt his wealth. He wasn't a fan of luxury cars or designer suits. Tonight, he was dressed simply in a dark jacket, a plain grey t-shirt, and well-worn jeans, his sneakers showing signs of their many miles traveled. He had no intention of turning heads. Tonight was supposed to be a personal celebration, a rare night where he could escape the pressure of running a billion-dollar company and enjoy a good meal in peace. He entered the bistro with a sense of quiet confidence, not seeking attention but aware that the very nature of his presence might attract some. The hostess, a young woman with impeccable style, greeted him warmly. She didn't bat an eye at his attire and led him to his seat without hesitation. As Miles sat down at the cozy corner table, he noticed the immaculate white tablecloth, the flickering candles, and the smooth jazz playing softly in the background. He could feel the weight of the night settling in. It had been a long day of meetings, conference calls, and decisions that would shape the future of his company. But tonight, he was here for something else, something simple. A chance to enjoy a meal, to savor the taste of a perfectly cooked steak without any distractions. He glanced at the menu, smiling slightly at the prices. Not that it mattered to him, the numbers were just numbers. It was the experience that mattered. He was in no rush, taking in the ambience, letting himself relax. He adjusted his watch, a modest model, not a flashy one, but one that held sentimental value, and picked up the wine list. A couple of minutes passed before the waiter arrived. The waiter, a tall man with sharp features and a white shirt, stood before Miles. He had a polite, yet slightly aloof expression, like someone who had seen it all and wasn't particularly impressed by anything anymore. "Good evening," the waiter said curtly, offering a brief nod. "May I start you off with a drink?" Miles smiled and said, "Just water, please." Still, the waiter barely acknowledged him as he turned to fetch the drink. Miles noted the coldness in his demeanor, but he wasn't about to make a fuss. After all, the waiter didn't know who he was. For now, that didn't matter. As the waiter returned with his water, Miles tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had started to creep in. He was used to being in rooms where he was the center of attention, boardrooms, tech conferences, and exclusive parties, but here, at the bistro, it was different. The waiter's aloofness felt almost intentional, as if Miles didn't belong in this space, as if his casual attire had made him invisible in the eyes of the staff. The waiter placed the water down with a slight splash, then walked away without another word. Miles watched as the man glided through the room, greeting other patrons with smiles that seemed sincere, almost warm. But with Miles, it was as if he didn't exist. Miles took a deep breath, trying not to let the awkwardness affect him. He wasn't here to confront anyone, he was here to relax, to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Minutes passed, and still, the waiter never returned to check on him. Miles finally ordered his meal, opting for the rib-eye steak, medium rare, with garlic mashed potatoes on the side. His voice was calm, unbothered, as he made his choice. But the waiter's attitude remained unchanged, distant, even dismissive. As the meal finally arrived, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. The steak was perfectly cooked, but it was hard to enjoy with the subtle undertone of disrespect that lingered. The bread basket was delivered with little care, almost knocking over his water glass. As the waiter placed it down, he muttered, "Here's your bread," before turning on his heel and walking away. Miles watched him go, a mix of confusion and irritation bubbling inside. He wasn't someone who let small things get under his skin. But tonight, something felt different. It wasn't just the poor service, it was the feeling that he wasn't being treated like everyone else, that he was being judged based on his appearance. As Miles cut into his steak, savoring the rich, buttery flavor, the hum of the restaurant surrounded him. The conversation of the other patrons was a soft backdrop, like the whispers of a distant world he didn't belong to. Each bite of the perfectly cooked meat reminded him of the long hours he'd spent building his company. And he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. Yet, the discomfort he'd been trying to shake off lingered. It wasn't just the service, it was the way he had been made to feel invisible. Miles was no stranger to being judged based on appearances. But this was different. The waiter had barely acknowledged him. And now, as he surveyed the room, it seemed as though everyone else had their attention divided among each other. Yet none of them were even glancing his way. He took another sip of water, his eyes scanning the room as a sense of unease settled deeper into his chest. The other tables were filled with well-dressed guests, men in sharp suits, women in elegant dresses, their voices rising in laughter, punctuated by the clinking of glasses. But none of them seemed to be bothered by the subtle discomfort that had taken root in Miles' stomach. No one else had to deal with the faint feeling of being unwelcome. A family of 4 at the table across from him was laughing over a shared bottle of wine, their conversation warm and light. Miles watched them for a moment, noticing the way their waiter was attentive, polite, and even indulged in their jokes with an easy smile. No hesitation, no coldness. The contrast between his experience and theirs was striking. His stomach churned. It wasn't just the waiter, either. A couple of patrons were sneaking glances at him. He caught them looking him over, their eyes moving from his sneakers to his plain shirt and back to his face. It was like they were trying to figure out who he was, what his story was, why someone like him would be here. Their expressions were polite, but there was something calculating in the way they observed him. Finally, the waiter returned with the wine, his hands steady but his face still devoid of warmth. As he placed the bottle down, he didn't bother to check if Miles wanted a refill. Instead, he simply turned to leave. "Excuse me," Miles said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "I ordered a glass of red wine with my meal. Can I have that now?" The waiter paused, a slight shift in his posture. He turned back toward Miles, his eyes cold. "Sure," he said curtly, his voice dripping with impatience. "I'll get that for you." Miles watched as he walked off, his back straight, never meeting his gaze. Miles' fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Something inside him was snapping. He tried to let it go, tried to focus on his meal. But this was too much. This was no longer just about bad service. It was about something deeper, something personal. As he stared at the waiter, He noticed the man's attention shift to another table. There, a group of well-dressed businessmen were laughing loudly, holding glasses of expensive wine and gesturing animatedly as they discussed the latest mergers and acquisitions. Their waiter was pouring wine with enthusiasm, laughing along with them, engaging in the conversation. Miles couldn't help but notice the stark difference in treatment. The disparity was undeniable. It was clear he wasn't being treated with the same level of attention, respect, or courtesy. It wasn't about the wine. It wasn't even about the food. It was about how people like him were treated differently based on the way they dressed, the way they presented themselves. He wasn't one of the suits. He wasn't part of the exclusive club. Minutes passed. Finally, the wine arrived. But by then, the damage had been done. Miles' appetite had soured. His steak, once mouth-watering, now seemed like an afterthought. He had been too busy trying to ignore the frustration building in him to truly appreciate the food. He pushed the plate aside, feeling the weight of the situation settle more heavily on his chest. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. He had spent years earning his success, working harder than most, and yet it didn't seem to matter. Here he was, in a restaurant that prided itself on luxury and sophistication, and he was treated as an outsider simply because he wasn't dressed to the standards the world expected of him. The bread basket arrived, but it was delivered with the same cold indifference as everything else. The waiter didn't even glance at him as he set it down with little care, nearly knocking over Miles' glass of water in the process. Miles took a deep breath. This was it, the final straw. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape that made a few heads turn. His eyes locked on the waiter, who was walking past his table again, his back stiff with the same arrogance. "Excuse me," Miles said, his voice steady, though a trace of frustration lingered. "There's a stain on my tablecloth, and I'd like it cleaned up." The waiter stopped, his eyes flickering to the stain, a small wine spill from earlier. But instead of offering an apology, the waiter just shrugged. "It's just a little spill," the waiter said dismissively. "I'll have someone come take care of it." Miles raised an eyebrow. "You'll send someone? Not you?" The waiter looked him over, as if sizing him up, and then responded with a short, flat, "I'm busy." It was too much. The treatment, the indifference, the assumption that Miles didn't matter. "Right," Miles said, his voice tight. "You're busy. I get it." The waiter walked off without another word, disappearing into the crowd. Miles sat back down, his jaw clenched, and stared out at the room. It wasn't just the waiter. It wasn't just the service. It was the fact that his presence wasn't acknowledged. He wasn't seen as a person, just another customer, another face in the crowd. The night had started with the quiet hope of a peaceful meal. Now, it felt like a lesson in human nature, in how people could make judgments without even knowing who you were, simply based on your appearance. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Miles sat at his table, staring out of the window, the reflection of the city lights casting a faint glow on his face. The wine sat untouched in front of him, the rich red liquid reflecting his mood more than anything else. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but there was a quiet fury within him, a growing recognition of how deeply ingrained the biases of society could be. He thought about standing up and leaving, but something stopped him. He'd been underestimated all his life. People had always assumed things about him based on the way he looked, based on what he wore, or who they thought he was. But tonight, it wasn't just about him. It was about a system that allowed people to treat others this way. A system that excused disrespect and looked the other way. And then it happened. The waiter, Kyle, reappeared. He was carrying the check, a small black leather folder in his hand. His eyes avoided Miles, his face tense with the same indifference that had marked the entire evening. He placed the folder on the table with a slight thud, the quiet sound cutting through the silence that had settled over the room. "Here's your check," Kyle said, his voice clipped. "Anything else?" Miles looked up at him, his gaze unwavering. "No, I think I'm good," he replied, his tone calm but firm. He knew this wasn't just about the meal anymore. This was about standing up for himself, for anyone who had ever been treated the way he had tonight. But something about Kyle's presence, the way he avoided eye contact, the lack of any apology for the service, made Miles' blood boil. As he opened the check, Miles' eyes immediately fell on a handwritten note at the bottom of the bill. His fingers froze as he read the words, "Dress code is business casual." FYI. It was a punch to the gut. Miles sat there for a moment, staring at the note, trying to process what he was reading. It wasn't just a comment about his attire. It was a subtle jab, a reminder that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't up to the standard of the other guests. And it wasn't even something the waiter had the decency to say to his face. It was tucked quietly into the bill. A final passive-aggressive remark. His breath caught in his chest, and for a second, the room seemed to fade away. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him now, some curious, some uncomfortable, all witnessing this small act of discrimination. His heart raced, and for a moment, he considered leaving, but then he thought of the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. Just as Miles was about to speak, a voice rang out across the room. "Miles?" All heads turned toward the entrance. A tall man in a sharp, tailored suit was walking toward him, his face lit up with a broad grin. He exuded confidence, with the kind of commanding presence that immediately drew attention. Miles' tension eased slightly as a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It was Nathan Caldwell, the owner of the bistro. Miles had known Nathan for years. They had worked together on several projects. And Nathan had always been a warm, approachable figure in the world of high-end dining. "Hey, I had no idea you were coming in tonight," Nathan exclaimed as he reached the table. He pulled Miles into a quick hug, his broad frame blocking out the view of the other diners. "Should have told me. I would have cleared the whole place out for you." Miles chuckled, shaking his head. "I just wanted a quiet meal." Nathan didn't want to make a fuss. Nathan frowned slightly as he looked down at the table. His eyes immediately fell on the stain from the spilled wine, and then on the untouched glass of wine next to it. "Quiet, huh?" Nathan muttered, his tone sharp. "What's with the stain? And where's your wine refill? Kyle, why isn't this table being properly attended to?" The room fell silent. Miles sat back in his chair, watching as Nathan's gaze fixed on Kyle, who had been standing nearby, his hands nervously clutching a napkin. Kyle's face went pale as he realized what was happening. The color drained from his cheeks, and he stiffened, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. Kyle stammered, his voice faltering. "I thought." Nathan's gaze hardened. "You thought what? You thought you could treat one of my guests like this and get away with it?" Kyle's eyes flickered nervously between Miles and Nathan. He opened his mouth to speak but was cut off by Nathan's firm voice. "Do you even know who this is?" Nathan asked, his voice calm but deadly serious. Kyle swallowed hard, his face flushed with the realization that his mistake was about to be exposed. He opened his mouth again but couldn't find the words. Miles, sensing the opportunity, leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. Maybe I should introduce myself. Kyle, he said, his tone even but firm. I'm Miles Turner, the founder of Turner Technologies. I just signed a contract worth over $100 million today. You may have heard of us? There was a brief pause as the room went still. The other patrons, who had been whispering among themselves just moments ago, turned their attention toward him with newfound curiosity. Miles could see the realization dawning on Kyle, and the look of horror spreading across his face. Nathan's expression softened slightly, but his eyes never left Kyle. This is a friend of mine. Kyle, Nathan said, a very close friend. He turned back to Miles, his voice now warmer. I'm sorry, Miles. This is absolutely unacceptable. This kind of treatment won't be tolerated. Miles nodded, his gaze still fixed on Kyle. It's not just about me, Nathan. It's about how people like Kyle think they can treat anyone differently based on their appearance, their clothes, or their assumptions. Kyle's face twisted in embarrassment as he mumbled something under his breath. But the words didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. Nathan turned back to the staff, his voice now commanding. Kyle, he said, his tone ice cold. We'll be having a private conversation after this. For now, you're dismissed. Kyle didn't protest. His shoulders slumped in defeat. And without another word, he turned and walked briskly toward the kitchen. The silence in the room hung heavy for a moment before the murmurs started again. Quieter this time, as the other diners processed what had just transpired. Nathan returned his attention to Miles. I'm so sorry, Miles. I'll make sure this never happens again. Miles gave a small smile. It's not about the service, Nathan. It's about making sure that nobody else has to feel like this. Nathan nodded gravely. You're right. And I will make sure that it changes. The room seemed to breathe again as Kyle disappeared into the kitchen. The hushed murmurs among the patrons grew louder, and the once stiff atmosphere loosened. For Miles, it felt like an odd form of victory, though he hadn't come to the bistro for a confrontation. It was clear that something needed to change. And the change was happening. Right here, right now. Nathan stood at the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the remaining staff, then turning back to Miles. His voice was firm but laced with a quiet regret. Miles, I'm truly sorry. This will never happen again. Not under my roof. You have my word. Miles nodded, his expression still calm but resolute. He knew Nathan meant it. This wasn't about the mistakes of one night, it was about ensuring it never happened again. I don't want special treatment, Nathan, Miles said, his voice steady. I'm not here to make an example of anyone. But what just happened, it's bigger than us. It's about a mindset that allows people like Kyle to treat others as less than. We need to hold each other accountable. Nathan's face softened as he nodded in agreement. I get it. I'll make sure the staff understands that respect has to be part of the job. No exceptions. I'll deal with Kyle. Miles smiled slightly, his eyes flicking back to the room of diners. They were still watching, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. He knew that many of them had witnessed something significant tonight. The glances they gave him, the almost apologetic looks, they were now seeing the power of standing up for oneself, of challenging assumptions without losing dignity. Just then, the older woman who had earlier exchanged glances with Miles from the neighboring table stood up. Her silver hair gleamed under the chandelier as she walked over to his table. There was a quiet strength in her step, and as she reached him, she offered a small, respectful smile. Miles, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to say thank you. She paused, her eyes sincere. You handled that situation with such grace. I can't tell you how much it means to see someone stand up for themselves. For all of us, really. I've been in situations like this many times. But you've shown us all what it really means to hold your ground. Miles was momentarily taken aback. He hadn't expected this kind of recognition. He'd been so focused on the broader lesson, on making sure this didn't happen again, that he hadn't considered how much this moment could mean to others. To see someone else notice, someone who had probably dealt with their own share of subtle prejudices, brought a deeper sense of validation. I appreciate that, Miles said, his voice low but sincere. It's not just about me. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through what I went through tonight. Too many people feel like they don't belong, that they're judged by their looks or their status. We can do better. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. We can, she said quietly, and you've reminded us of that. She turned to leave, but then hesitated. My husband and I, she began, her voice catching slightly. We'll be following your work more closely now. Thank you for this lesson tonight. Miles watched her walk back to her table, her words lingering in the air. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Sometimes it wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping changes, it was about the quiet, meaningful shifts that happened when one person chose to stand up. The clinking of glasses resumed around him, and slowly, the chatter of the room began to fill the space once more. But there was an underlying shift in the atmosphere, one that could not be ignored. People were now more aware, more reflective. They had seen the uncomfortable truth of what had happened, and perhaps, for the first time, they were questioning their own biases, their own assumptions. Nathan returned to the table, his face serious but understanding. Miles, he began, his voice low, I want to make this right. Not just for you, but for everyone who walks through those doors. I'll be speaking to the staff, and I'll be taking action. Miles shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. You don't need to do anything extra, Nathan. Just make sure this place is welcoming to everyone. No matter what they're wearing, no matter who they are. It's not about fancy clothes or status, it's about respect. Nathan nodded, his brow furrowing slightly in thought. You're right, he said. I've been so focused on maintaining the exclusive aspect of the restaurant. I forgot about the essence of what hospitality should be. I promise you, Miles, I won't forget again. Just as the conversation seemed to close, another waiter approached, one who had been observing from the sidelines. He was visibly different, more polished, more professional. There was no hesitation in his step, no dismissive attitude. He offered Miles a warm smile as he began to reset the table. Can I get you anything else, sir? He asked politely, his tone genuinely attentive. Miles smiled back, his voice steady but warm. I think I'm good, thank you. Just, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. The waiter nodded, and as he went about his work, the whole room seemed to shift into a more comfortable, respectful space. There were still some quiet murmurs, some lingering tension, but now, it wasn't about the injustice that had just taken place, it was about how it was being corrected. As the night wore on, the final moments of the evening played out as they should, Miles enjoying the final course of his meal, Nathan quietly discussing the changes that would be put in place, and the rest of the patrons reflecting on the quiet power of standing up for what's right. Miles finished his meal, content in the knowledge that, while this night hadn't gone as planned, it had been a step in the right direction. He wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't looking for accolades. He simply wanted a world where people didn't judge others based on assumptions, where everyone could walk into a room and feel welcome, regardless of what they were wearing or how much money they made. As Miles left the bistro that night, he stepped into the cool evening air, his mind still buzzing from the events. He glanced up at the sign hanging above the door, its soft glow a symbol of luxury, but also of the change he hoped to inspire. For the first time in a long while, he felt that the world might just be a little bit better than when he had entered it. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the best victory of all.